everyone, and thank you for joining today's conversation regarding equity. My name is Michelle Brown, and I am the Executive Vice President of Programs here at the Council for Professional Recognition. Some of my responsibilities include supporting our policy agenda, supporting the credentialing department, and international relations, and many other things. I actually entered the field about 30 years ago as a Head Start teacher. I did my student teaching and lead teaching at a Head Start program in Toledo, Ohio. One thing I want to mention to you about my background that's very important is about 20 years ago, the Council for Professional Recognition actually brought me to Washington, D.C. by way of the National Head Start Fellowship. I was a part of Class 6, and I have stayed on in DC doing national work, and me serving as the Executive Vice President, the Council for Professional Recognition is a homecoming of sorts. So I'm glad to be here with you to have this important conversation with you and Dr. Shantel Meek, Founding Director of the Children's Equity Project, and also a professor of practice with the T. Denny School of Social and Family Dynamics at Arizona State University. Welcome, Dr. Shantel. How are you this afternoon?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited to be here with you today.
I'm so excited to have you. And so I'm going to pause for a second and allow you to tell our early childhood family a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. So Shantel Meek, I'm at Arizona State University. I developed and founded and lead the Children's Equity Project, which we'll dive into a little bit more in just a bit. In terms of me and where I come from, I'm the granddaughter of Mexican immigrants on both sides. Mm-hmm. I grew up in a small border town in southern Arizona, very bilingual, binational community. My grandparents on my mom's side immigrated when they had 2 small children, and they had 5 more, and my mom was the youngest one of them. And they moved to kind of a rural community in Arizona. And the rules at the time were that there was corporal punishment for anyone who spoke Spanish. And my grandparents, of course, my grandfather was learning, my grandmother refused to speak English and spoke only in Spanish. She's proud of it. But the kids all learned English in school, right? And so I hear stories of her riding the school bus every day with all of her kids to go to school, and to go to this school where it was actually against the rules to be speaking the language that she spoke and the language that her kids spoke. And I just think of like that strength and where we come from and where I come from. And so those are part of my roots. And I kind of grew up there and then went to Arizona State University, stayed close to home to go to college. And then I don't know if we'll talk about this later, but then I jumped over to DC to work for the Obama administration, and the rest is history. So.
Thank you, Dr. Meeks. And we will talk about more of your background later. I just want to acknowledge the fact that you have such rich and diverse experiences that you bring to the work. And I want to thank you for sharing that with us. So why don't we go ahead and get started with our conversation? Is it okay if I go to question number 1?
Go ahead, jump in.
Okay. So Dr. Meek, we created CounciLIVE to invite leaders to speak on the most important topics and issues in early childhood education today. And so for both the Council and Children's Equity Project, we know one of the most important issues to address in early childhood education is equity, right? And our vision at the Council is to ensure that all professional early childhood educators and caregivers meet the developmental, emotional, and educational needs of our nation's youngest children. And we know the best way to ensure this happens is to continue our long-standing and deeply rooted commitment to equity. So for example, equity touches all of the CDA competency, standards, and functional areas, which I know you know that well. So for example, ranging from social to safety to families and more. So before we begin this vitally important conversation, we always love to hear from our guests. So Dr. Meek, if you don't mind, can you tell us a little bit about what led you to your passion for research in early childhood equity, and what is the driving force behind your work today?
Yeah, that's the best question to start with, right? So I think I mentioned a little bit just now about my roots. The community where I grew up was, I don't know what the statistic is, but it must be over 95% Mexican and Mexican American, almost 100% bilingual. Kind of joke sometimes that you go to McDonald's and you're just as likely to get your order taken in English as you are in Spanish, or maybe more likely in Spanish. My grandmother took care of me and was my childcare growing up, and she lived probably like 200 feet from the border fence, and I could see it from my backyard too. So, it's like a very resilient and tight knit and good community. It also has its challenges. Every school in the community is a Title I school. But growing up, what do you know about Title I school? It's just life, right? By the time I got to high school, I remember, again, similar to the rest of the communities, vast majority Mexican, Mexican American. I remember having a teacher, and often we talk about the really positive teacher experiences, and I had lots of those. But I remember this particular high school teacher that he asked us, raise your hand if you want to go to university, after high school. And like over half the class raised their hand, including me. And then his response was, well, maybe one of you will make it to the university, a couple more to the community college, and the rest of you aren't going anywhere. And this was, a white teacher in a classroom of all Mexican and Mexican American. So it was like an added dynamic there. But, I remember then, going to college. I went to ASU. I got my degrees. I wanted to stay close to home, very close. But around the 2-year mark during my PhD program, Barack Obama was running for president. And I was just incredibly inspired by him, by his story, by his policy stances. So I cold applied to the White House internship. I didn't know anyone in DC. I had never done any policy, anything, no policy training, nothing. And I got in. So I moved to DC. And I did the internship, and I loved the policy space, and I loved the city, and I loved the whole environment and everything about it. And so when a political appointment opened up in early childhood, which is what I was getting my PhD in, they called me and appointed me. And so I started on the job while I was finishing my PhD, my dissertation. And so I was working during the day for the administration.
I remember that, yes.
And then I was writing all night and all weekend for my dissertation. So, when getting to DC, it was interesting, especially at the White House internship. There were a lot of Ivy League folks, and people from state schools were like a minority. And I just kind of look at the difference there. Like when I was in high school, like only a small percentage of kids made it to a university, and it was always a state university. Like the Ivy Leagues and anything out of state was like didn't even enter our realm of imagination. But then when we got there, it was like, oh, there's a whole world of other, So I think all of these experiences kind of combined, and like stepping back and looking at the uneven opportunity in places, and the fact that, they weren't any smarter than me, the folks who went to an Ivy League, and I wasn't any smarter than the kids who may not have gone to university, but there's just a really uneven playing field starting in the earliest years, and starting about, how we talk about families and how we think about families. And so when I started working in the early childhood office, I worked on a whole bunch of things. I worked on Head Start issues, on childcare issues, state advisory councils, worked with states on a variety of things. But the issues that really kept me up at night and really drove me during the day were the equity issues that we were working on. Discipline, inclusion, and segregation of kids with disabilities, the dual language pieces. And that's what I really gravitated toward and kind of took a leadership role in. And so after the end of the administration, I started the CEP with one of the driving motivators was really continuing the equity work that we had started within or not started, but had been doing in the administration, and finding a home for it outside of government. So I think, to answer your question, I mean, I think going back from before, like my roots and like where I came from, and like my grandmother and my both grandmothers actually immigrated. My mom and my dad's journeys, and us and the community where I grew up in, and kind of then progressing right to college in a new environment, and then in DC, and my experiences there. I think I've always just had an eye toward opportunity and opportunity gaps. And when we think about early childhood, as you know, and as all early childhood people know, right, like that is the time to fix it and to fix those systems that are starting that trajectory of uneven opportunity across the lifespan. So.
Definitely. I want to say a couple things in response to what you just shared. I want to tell you thank you for sharing your personal journey, a lot about your family background and your family's journey. And I just want to tell you, you hit that why. You hit it straight. And it was inspirational, and it's powerful, your why, and it makes sense. I've seen you present several times, and so your presentations, your why lives there as well. And I just wanted to make a comment to one of the points that you made about your teacher and sort of that low expectation, and it stood out to me. And this is one of the reasons why I think the work we're doing with you, CEP, and also the work that the field is doing around equity is so powerful. The biggest obstacle to student success is the adults who believe they cannot succeed, right? And the behaviors that follow that belief. So, right, we have to have teachers that have high expectations of all the children in their classroom. And the work that you're doing at the Children's Equity Project, I think, promotes that belief, or it's kind of what changed. What's that saying, Dr. Meek? The rising of tide lifts all boats? Yeah, definitely. So I want to tell you thank you for that. So we kind of touched on it already, but for the members of our audience who have not yet heard this, since February, the Council for Professional Recognition and the Children's Equity Project have been working in partnership to further equity in the early childhood field, right? Through the council's work, right? So the partnership was made possible by a grant that the Children's Equity Project received from the Trust for Learning, which focuses on increasing the knowledge, awareness, and understanding of early educators on issues of equity, bias, and systemic racism. So again, both organizations, the Council and the Children's Equity Project, which you've heard so well already from Dr. Shantel Meek, are committed to ensuring high quality, equitable learning conditions and opportunities and experiences for all young children, as well as, and this is what the Children's Equity Project is helping the council with as well as ensuring high quality, equitable credentialing, right? CDA credentialing for all. So for those who have not heard of the Children's Equity Project until today, Dr. Meek, can you tell the audience more about the organization and the unique work you're doing in the early childhood education field?
Yeah, so we've talked about it a little bit already, as you mentioned, but the CEP works at kind of the intersection of policy, practice, and research. Mm-hmm. So we do all three of those things, and we look at the intersection between all of those things, and they all inform each other. You know, I mentioned one of the motivations for starting the CEP was to continue a lot of the work that we were doing inside of government, finding a place outside of government to house it. Another big reason was because when we stopped and looked across the field, you know, there's lots of big national organizations. Many of them care about equity and have equity as part of their mission, or have equity as you know, something they do. But we didn't find a whole lot of organizations that were exclusively focused on equity, where that was their only job and that was the only thing they thought of, and that was their number one main core mission. And so we wanted to create a place where that was all we did. Like, all we do is equity. All we think about is equity across a number of different domains and dimensions. And so in terms of the work we do, on a really concrete level, we have an arm of work that is training technical assistants, working on, improving equitable practice and culturally responsive and anti-racist practice at kind of the teacher, coach, consultant level. And then we have another body of work that is much more policy and systems focused. Mm-hmm. We do a lot of kind of data analysis, policy analysis, and provide a lot of recommendations on building more equitable systems, all the way from Congress down to the local level and everything in between. So I think one of the main things that I wanted to do with the CEP was to make equity tangible and measurable, and to operationalize it in a way that is clear and concrete. Because so often our conversations about equity, especially now as time has gone on, are like at a higher kind of level. They're a little abstract sometimes. People aren't sure how to change their jobs or change what they're doing tomorrow to embody equity. We're not sure what it looks like in policy. And so really trying to operationalize equity within practice, within policy. And the way that we think you do that is by identifying all of the different policies, right? And where systemic racism and bias and disproportionate or disparate impact are having a disproportionate effect on kids of color, kids from other historically marginalized communities. So our framework, which I think you kind of referenced a little bit earlier, is to really look at equitable access. So who gets to get into the system, who gets to get resources, who gets to get services, experiences once they get in the system. So what are they getting access to, right? Are they getting positive, fair experiences? Are they having high expectations? Are they having appropriate supports and good experiences?
Yes.
Are they getting kicked out the back door? Or are they getting English forced down their throats when we know bilingual education, right, is great for dual language learners? So the experiences once they're in the door. And then the outcomes, and making sure that we are accountable for actually changing outcomes, and making sure that we're breaking the link between demographic characteristics and outcomes, right? The color of your skin, your race, where your zip code, right? Your disability shouldn't be predictive of your outcome. And so and making sure that we're accountable for that, for narrowing and closing those disparities. So that, in a nutshell, I think is a lot of our work.
Well, I want to respond to that quickly. I just want to say on behalf, I'm going to speak for the early childhood field, not just for the council, that we are so grateful for your laser focus on equity, and that the child is at the center, and that a lot of what you put out, whether it's the practice or policy, that exudes to me that we come from a strength-based approach, right? All children. So I love that. And then, as a true early childhood educator, I think oftentimes I underestimated I lived in the programming and the practices world and didn't understand the power of systems. And so I love that you're bringing that in a practical way to the field so people can understand how systems impact services and what that means for outcomes for children and families. So I want to tell you thank you for that as well. It's powerful. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and close out. That was our second question, I think, Dr. Meek. We're going to go ahead and go on to our third question. You ready?
Sounds good. Okay.
So we love the Children's Equity Project's focus on closing opportunity gaps, which we've been talking about, through strategic research-based policy decisions. Many of our listeners are early childhood educators who work in a variety of classroom and childcare settings. So here's the question for you. For those listening, many may not have experience in research or policy, but are committed to making a difference in the everyday lives of our youngest learners. What do you feel is most important for early childhood educators to know about opportunity gaps and when those gaps emerge for young children? And how can early educators make an impact each day with the children they teach? That was a lot. Do you need me to read again, or you're good?
No, I'm good. I'm good. So I'll answer the opportunity gap question first, and then we'll talk about what early educators can do. I think the opportunity gap kind of concept came as a direct pushback to the achievement gap terminology.
Yes. Talk about that, Dr. Meek. Tell them.
Because the achievement gap when we think about an achievement gap, it feels very child focused. Like
Yes.
the child is not achieving X, right? When we change, and which leads you to then there's something wrong with the child's not learning X, whatever, or the family or the community or the culture, you name it. When we talk about the opportunity gap, it's not a gap in skills, it's not a gap in ability, it's not a gap in potential. It is a gap in the systems and opportunities that kids have access to. And so if we got rid of those gaps in opportunity and everybody had opportunity and resources and positive experiences, then we wouldn't have an achievement gap. We wouldn't have any gaps in the outcomes, right? And so it is a shift in focus from the child unit to the system, because our kids aren't broken, our systems are broken. And so honing in on how we fix the system and how we improve the system and how we even out opportunity and distribute it equitably is where the focus needs to be. And so one just really concrete example of this is when we think about discipline. Right?
Yes.
We know that there are these really pervasive racial disparities in suspension and expulsion from preschool all the way through the academic trajectory in K-12. However, we also know that there is no data, no research study anywhere that's found that Black children behave worse. They don't behave worse. They don't have more frequent misbehaviors. There's no difference there. However, they are significantly more likely to experience harsh discipline and exclusionary discipline. So that doesn't match up, right? Like what is the missing piece? There is a system and there's bias in policies and there's bias all the way from the individual, interpersonal and systemic level that is driving that disparity, and it's forcing that open. And it's not about the child's challenging behavior, which we often equate it to. It's about everything else. And so I think the shift from talking about, the things of focus is to fix the child, which so much of our fields and lots of fields have historically done, including in K-12 education, to a systems focus, like how do we fix the system to make sure that kids are getting positive experiences, access to resources, high expectations, all these other things to close those gaps. And so I think that is the important distinction to talk about in terms of what folks should know. In terms of what early educators can do, did you want to jump in? Do you want to jump in there?
No, I just wanted to say how profound everything that you're sharing is so profound. And I just wanted to regurgitate, I've been scribbling notes. I'm still learning from you, Dr. Meek, that I want to make sure our audience heard what you said, that this gap isn't really about the children. It's about the systems, access, opportunities that they have, and really the exposure to high quality preschool learning, programming and services. I mean, to me, summarizing, but I say that and it just really stuck with me. It's so powerful. And I just hope that our ECE family is hearing what you're saying as well. So let me go on pause. I'm going to go on mute and let you finish.
No. I think that's great. In terms of what early educators can do, I mean, that's where the rubber hits the road. All early childhood people know that it all happens in adult-child interactions, and that's where it starts. And so I think part of it is understanding and addressing biases at the individual and at the interpersonal level, and interrogating those and being aware of those, and consistently and continuously working to address those. And I think the second part of it, which is where a lot of our work lies, is on advocacy for policy change. And so a lot of early educators might not be in the administrator role or control the budget or control the policy handbook, but they can certainly organize and advocate at the program level, at their local level and beyond, right? On looking, like, are we collecting the right data? Are we disaggregating that data so we can see and make sure that there aren't any big gaps in what we're giving kids and what kids have access to? Do we have any policies that seem to be having a disparate impact on Black children and Latino children, on kids with disabilities, and looking at that and advocating and organizing for that? Because it happens at both, and both levels are really important, right? The individual level is really important, and the
Yes.
interpersonal level and the relationship building and being aware of these pieces is important. But the policy part is important too, and really thinking through our role as advocates and organizing together to push for more equitable policy and transparency in data and accountability, I think is equally important. So I'll pause there.
Well, I just want to say thank you. And what I took away from that last part of your answer is that it's not just leaders, it's classroom teachers, it's everyone in the life of a child that should always have equity and equitable outcomes right at the forefront of everything they do every day. There should be some intentionality there at all times.
Yeah.
So I think that's great. So Dr. Meek, in the interest of time, is it okay if I close out this question and move on to our fourth question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Okay, so since your time, so this is kind of a question that's pushing the rewind button, right? Okay, so since your time as a graduate student, where you focused your thesis on the interplay between genetic and environmental influences on child development, how have your research interests changed over time, and how does it inform your policy-driven work today?
That's such an interesting question that I haven't been asked. But, you know, I came from a psychology program as an undergraduate, and psychology is very internal, right? Internal facing. It's about the study of individuals' psychology, not about systems, not about groups of people even. And so that was kind of the background that I brought. And so in my PhD program, I did a lot of work on thinking about children's exposure and relationships with parents, with teachers, with, again, going back to that one-to-one interaction, right? And the serve and return. And I also kind of
serve and return. I still talk about it all the time.
Yeah.
That way it's powerful, but go ahead.
No, that's right. And I looked at it, I was really interested in neuroscience. And we didn't have a neuroscientist on our faculty, but we had someone who studied behavior genetics. And so I started looking at that. And if anyone who has more than one kid knows how different kids can be, even within the same household, the same parents, and everything, and how they can elicit different responses and reactions from parents and get different parenting even under the same roof. So anyway, it was very, very kind of at the individual level was a lot of my work. And like I said, I didn't have any policy or systems training before. I also did early intervention, and I did inclusion support services, and I worked on, I did some parent training with parents of kids with disabilities. So a lot of my work was very one-on-one. My research was one-on-one. My applied work and my intervention stuff was one-on-one. And I think that's just drastically different from where a lot of my focus is now, which is all systems and policy and lots of levels up. Yeah, go ahead, jump in.
Well, I say, so it's interesting. It's different, but I just think it's great how it feels like your steps have been ordered, because a lot of your work, your doctoral work really served as a foundation for you to be able to move on into the systems work and the advocacy type of work you're doing, at least to me, through my early childhood lens. So I think that it's awesome, because I don't know that you would be as impactful as you are in the systems area if you hadn't done that foundational work. You know, what comes to mind to me is the Head Start House, that framework for effective practice, right? You know, right, the foundation is all about those interactions that children have with adults and those relationships, those one-on-one experiences, and really seeing how, and then, as you move up the house, you see how children are doing collectively, but individually, and that's how you begin to support them, that whole one-on-one support. And I just think about you having, such depth in that area. That's why you're so bomb diggity at what I just wanted to say that. And folks that know me know that's one of my favorite terms. And if you look it up in the Urban Dictionary, it means awesomeness in its purest form. I'm going to pause for a minute. Dr. Meek, and just ask you, was there anything else that you wanted to say about that question, or did I just throw you off completely?
No, that I think I said everything I needed to say. I think I'd never had anyone reflect on the experience that way, I guess, because I'd never been asked the question, but that is an interesting kind of sequence, because when I got to the policy world in DC, I didn't know anything about policy, but what I did know was child development and adult-child interactions. Like that is what I was deep on. Mm-hmm. And I learned the policy stuff along the way, thanks to a lot of really great mentors and people who are really patient and generous with their time. But I was deep in the child piece of it. And I do think that allows me to like always center that piece of it in our work.
Well, when you look at the children's equity projects, your mission and vision, it all makes sense, right? Yeah. That laser child focus. Go ahead, Dr. Meek and team. Okay, so let's go ahead and close out that question, because I'll have you here all afternoon talking about this is a topic that I'm passionate about as well, clearly. Okay, so this is it is really the last question before our closing. So, Dr. Meek, for those who want to dive deeper into learning about diversity, I'm going to say culture too, culture, diversity, inclusion, and equity in early childhood education, are there some resources that you would recommend to them?
That's a really good question. So I'm biased, but I'll recommend some of the CEP resources that we've released in the past few years. So those are all on our website, Children's Equity Project.
Does that include your webinars? You had a wonderful webinar series. Did you partner with the organization? I can't call it right now, but
yeah, we had a webinar series
awesome.
in partnership with Georgetown and the Center of Excellence, all about mental health consultation and mental health and equity, which I thought was really powerful lineup of speakers.
I did too.
And it dove deep into history. Like 75% of the content was not at all related to mental health consultation. It was about understanding the history, because we feel deeply that we need to understand the history so that we can understand how it applies to the conditions of today and how we fix those systems. And so we had that series, and we had one with the Bipartisan Policy Center as well when we released our Start with Equity report last summer. So all of those are up on their website. A few other organizations, the Kirwan Institute at the Ohio State University.
I'm from Ohio, and I'm at the Kirwan Institute, but let me not steal your thunder. Go ahead.
No, you should jump in. Awesome. So they do amazing work.
Oh my gosh, they do amazing work, and their training series, the one-on-one they do on implicit bias, powerful, and their relationship to Project Implicit at Harvard, and the encouragement, the links to be able to take the implicit bias test, et cetera, I think are wonderful. And the briefs that they put out every year on implicit bias in different, sectors of the community, I think is awesome as well.
So helpful. And they're free, and they're sequential modules that anyone can go on there and take. And so I think it's a really, really valuable resource. The UCLA Civil Rights Project. Puts out a lot of really good work. They've done a lot of work on segregation over the years and the history of it and what it looks like, and some work on disabilities and inclusion and equity, and a lot of work on discipline. And the Education Trust, I would say, is also one of our favorite organizations. I'm
going to add one to your list that I know awesome work with, and that's your partnership with the Office of Head Start, DTL. Let me see if I can get the whole name right. The Early Child Development Teaching and Learning Center.
Yep, that's right.
Some awesome work there. And then Head Start, of course, I've worked there for many years and being a Head Start fellow. Dr. Shantel, I bleed Head Start. So they have some wonderful things as well, and a couple seminal documents, if you don't mind, that I'll give a plug for. Is the document that because I'm going to be a Head Start alum forever. Supporting the school readiness and success of young African-American boys, the Head Start's multicultural principles. And we had a webinar series. When I say we, I was still a part of the National Centers team on advancing racial and ethnic equity in Head Start childhood programs. Those are great resources as well.
Yeah, that was right at the end of the last iteration of the National Centers. So there are lots of resources. I I too am very, very much a Head Start fan and prop it up any chance I get. We're also part of the National Center for Health, Behavioral Health, and Safety. So do a lot of health equity work too as part of that. So I'll just throw in that one. And then we're part of a third TA center, which is the Center of Excellence for Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health Consultation. They're all so long. But that one all focuses on building early childhood mental health consultation systems. And our job is really embedding equity across all of that. So yes, lots of good resources and lots more to come through all of those different facets.
Thank you, Dr. Meek, for sharing those resources. Okay, so why don't we go ahead? I feel like I've talked your ear off and I could keep you here all afternoon, but we know that can't happen. So Dr. Meek and ECE family, we're coming to the end of our discussion. But before we do, we want to thank you for joining us today on CounciLIVE, right? We've had a great session together, and it was a pleasure to be with you and have this conversation about equity, Dr. Meek.
So nice to be with you and to be with the community today.
Thank
you so much for the invite and the platform.
So before we close out today, I want to give you the final word. Are there any final thoughts? You've shared your resource, so are there any final thoughts that you want folks to walk away with?
No, I think we've covered it. You know, I'm just thankful to the council and to Dr. Moore's leadership, to your leadership, for really pushing forward on the equity front, and through our partnership, but through all of the work you're doing through the series, and through all of the different ways that you all are centering equity and really pushing it. And, you know, it's always been embedded in the council's work, as we know. But Dr. Moore's leadership and bringing you on and your leadership, it's just been a really exciting thing to watch and work alongside.
I agree with everything you said wholeheartedly, and I just want to tell you that we are honored and feel privileged to have this partnership with you, Dr. Meek, and the Children's Equity Project staff. And we are looking forward to a long relationship and our continued work together. Woohoo!
Woo! Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You guys have a good afternoon, and make sure if you have friends that you have them watch the replay of this CounciLIVE and look for the next announcement for our next CounciLIVE session. Take care.